And we will proceed with the next topic. That will be a government complicity. And we will be watching a video from a witness, Lily Greenberg.
May 2024, I served as a special advisor to the Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of the Interior. I was a political appointee in the Biden administration. My name is Lily Greenberg Call. I'm honored to be here with you all today virtually. I wish I could be there in person. Thank you for allowing me to speak today, members of the Tribunal, distinguished observers, and fellow witnesses. Again, it's an honor to be here with you and to be a part of this important process. My name is Lily Greenberg Call. Until May 2024, I served as a special advisor to the Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of the Interior. I was a political appointee in the Biden administration. I'm here to testify to the complicity of the United States government in what the world now recognizes as the genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza. I speak in my personal capacity as a Jewish American, as a former government official, and as a human being who decided that I could no longer be a part of an administration that was enabling mass death. I joined the Biden administration in January 2023 after working on the campaigns. I am a part of a generation of young public servants who believed that we were restoring moral leadership after the first Trump administration. And my work at the Department of Interior focused on climate, environmental policy, and protecting our natural resources. Although I was not in a national security agency, I witnessed through internal communications, appointee briefings, interagency coordination, and my interactions with senior White House officials, how the administration responded to events following October 7th, 2023. And I also witnessed the internal environment of fear, censorship, and moral paralysis that defined the administration's position towards Israel's assault on Gaza. My testimony draws from those experiences, from communications among colleagues, and from the public record that is now overwhelmingly demonstrates U.S. knowledge of and participation in Israel's genocidal campaign. After the attack on October 7, 2023, which killed 1,200 Israelis and took hostages, there was widespread grief throughout the administration. And I will add that that attack was something that hit me personally and my community very hard. I grew up in a very close and tight-knit Jewish community with friends and family in the United States and in Israel, and many people I know lost family members and loved ones on October 7th. The grief that I felt and that everyone felt after that was legitimate and deeply felt. And that grief was recognized very clearly by my colleagues in the administration. But almost immediately, it felt like grief was replaced with a directive for total political alignment with the Israeli government, regardless of its actions. There was an almost immediate cloud that kind of came over everyone working in government. Colleagues who had been in service much longer than me compared it to post 9/11, and some even to the Vietnam era, where it felt like they could not express any disagreement with US policy. Especially as an appointee, I served at the pleasure of the president. So those of us who were political appointees, I think, felt even more pressure to echo the president's public statements that emphasize Israel's right to defend itself, omit any acknowledgement of international law or civilian protection. And when internal questions arose about proportionality, aid access, or the scope of military support, they were met with silence or reprimand. To me, this was the beginning, at least in the post-October 7th landscape, of the United States' active complicity in the genocide, the deliberate decision to subordinate moral, legal, and humanitarian obligations in favor of political loyalty. Of course, I acknowledge and recognize that U.S. complicity in the genocide of the Palestinian people has been happening for many, many years. And I often echoed this statement to senior White House officials. When I was asked about my opinions on what was happening, I spoke as a Jewish American who was deeply impacted by October 7th and often told people that I did not feel unsafe as a Jew because of Hamas's attack, and I did not feel unsafe because of anything that the Palestinian people or any rhetoric I was experiencing from Arab or Muslim colleagues in the administration or fellow Americans. What made me feel unsafe was the United States support and enabling of Israel's system of apartheid and inequality and occupation that created the conditions for October 7th to happen. So it felt like by mid-October, I was hearing from other colleagues about intelligence and humanitarian briefings from across agencies that documented the scale of the destruction in Gaza, that thousands of civilians were killed in weeks, that entire neighborhoods were bombed, that warnings from aid organizations of imminent collapse of medical and food systems were going ignored. And these reports circulated internally, and they circulated informally in Signal group chats and among conversation. I know senior officials were aware of them, and I and others received updates confirming that the US government knew in real time that the continued arms transfers and diplomatic cover were facilitating war crimes. By November, thousands of US officials across multiple agencies had signed internal dissent cables or open letters calling for a ceasefire, and none of these warnings changed policy. The president continued to approve weapons shipments. The administration vetoed multiple UN Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire. And the justification, often repeated internally, was that halting support would undermine US credibility and embolden our adversaries. In truth, there was acknowledgement among government officials that this was not a policy problem. This was a political problem. This was about maintaining political control and avoiding confrontation with the pro-Israel lobby here in America. A pro-Israel lobby that, I might add, has become increasingly co-opted by Christian nationalists and Christian Zionists who have no interest in the safety of American Jews or Israeli Jews or any minority community, and have enabled and propped up the Trump administration, the MAGA regime, and the Christian nationalist, alt-right, authoritarian leadership that we are seeing currently. So from my understanding, and again, I was not part of any agency that was responsible for these acts of complicity, but I believe that the US government's complicity in the Gaza genocide took several concrete forms: material support, bombs, missiles, artillery shells, diplomatic protection, the US using its veto power at the United Nations to block international ceasefire efforts and investigations and shield Israel from accountability under international law, rhetorical cover. Senior officials consistently repeated Israel's false narratives, calling hospitals terrorist command centers or claiming that there were no credible alternative to military operations, which we knew was false, and especially displayed by the November 2023 deal that brought back many, many more hostages than any military operation. And then, of course, censorship and retaliation. So within the administration, the culture of silence meant that employees who spoke out faced professional isolation and threats to their careers, something that I experienced personally before I even resigned publicly. So this culture of fear ensured a continued silence and bureaucratic obedience. Inside my department, many people spoke about Gaza. It was not spoken about publicly, but privately, this dominated conversations among staff. I knew people, both inside my department and across government, were grieving and horrified and desperate for guidance. Sometimes within my agency, we were told that foreign policy is not our lane, to which I was very frustrated because this administration, the Biden administration, had made a concrete effort to hire appointees who were younger and more diverse than ever before. And I know that many of my Muslim and Arab colleagues expressed their frustration to senior officials, especially when their families were telling them that they should resign, that the administration was complicit in genocide and committing war crimes. And this sentiment was often expressed to senior White House leadership of, why did you hire us if you're not interested in what we actually have to bring to the table and what our communities have to say? I observed colleagues from across the administration express a quiet despair They knew that what Israel was doing in Gaza was morally indefensible. They knew that it was terrible not just for Palestinians, but for Israelis as well, and also for Americans to be associated with and known as the enablers of these crimes. Senior officials in defense and military agencies knew that the US supplied weapons were being used in civilian areas, in indiscriminate bombings of civilian areas. And so in December, when the International Court of Justice began considering South Africa's genocide case against Israel, the internal reaction in the administration was one of contempt, not reflection. It was mocked as political theater, and no one really questioned at a high level, I believe, what it meant for our own legal exposure. Ultimately, by early 2024, it became impossible for me to reconcile my service with my conscience. And I felt that I was doing everything I could from inside, whether that was organizing people across government to participate in vigils, to sign on to anonymous letters that got thousands of signatories, to have one-on-one conversations with their bosses, to see what levers of power we could pull internally. And ultimately, it felt like I had done everything I could. And there was no change that was being made. So I decided to resign in May of 2024, stating publicly that I could no longer represent a president that enabled the killing, starvation, and displacement of millions of Palestinians. I was the first Jewish political appointee, and unfortunately the only, to resign publicly over the genocide. I know that there were many others, Jewish appointees, who left the administration in large part because of Gaza, but did not do so publicly. I resigned also very close to the holiday of Passover, which is a holiday that is about liberation from oppression. And I remember in 2024, when I was celebrating Passover, knowing deep in my heart that the lesson to take from that holiday was to speak truth to power, to be like Moses in Pharaoh's kingdom, even when it means going against your community or the people who raised you, or the power that you've benefited from. My resignation was not in opposition to my Jewishness, right? It was because of it. Everything I've ever learned about what it means to be Jewish is that human life is of infinite value, and that to remain silent in the face of injustice is to participate in it. And I want to underscore that my resignation was not a heroic act. It was an act of moral survival. It was an acknowledgement of an understanding with myself that this was the biggest and most important thing I could do in the moment to potentially save lives. And that if I did not do that, I would be failing myself spiritually, morally, and I would not be the person that I want to be in this world. Remaining in that position would have meant accepting the destruction of an entire people as collateral damage, and in particular, the destruction of an entire people in the name of my people's supposed safety, with a president who was repeating that rhetoric consistently. By the end of 2024, the official record was that over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, and I am certain, and we know, that the real number is much, much more. Independent investigations have confirmed that Israel deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, aid convoys. Famine has spread as Israel blocked fuel and food. Tent camps in Rafah were bombed, and all of this was done with U.S. weapons funded by U.S. taxpayers and defended by U.S. diplomats. The administration could not claim ignorance. Every major humanitarian organization warned of the unfolding genocide. And yet the president continued to say Israel was acting within the bounds of international law, while also, regardless of international law, Israel was explicitly breaking the U.S.'s own laws, the Leahy laws, about military aid. This was not mere negligence, it was a conscious political choice. And I know why this happens, in part because of my own experience with the Israel lobby in the United States. Decades of unconditional military aid, political lobbying, and the normalization of Palestinian dehumanization in our politics. Lobbying groups like AIPAC and CUFI, Christians United for Israel, exert enormous influence on U.S. policy, shaping foreign aid and the boundaries of public speech, and elected officials often fear being labeled anti-Semitic if they even question Israeli actions or bring up conditioning aid, while Palestinians and their allies are criminalized for demanding freedom. This structural corruption makes accountability nearly impossible. What I think needs to happen, one of the many things that I think needs to happen, or more than acknowledgement, there needs to be an immediate suspension of all U.S. military aid and armed transfers to Israel, full cooperation with internal investigations into genocide and war crimes, reparations, humanitarian reconstructions for Gaza, protections for whistleblowers and dissenters, and structural reforms to end the influence of militarized and foreign lobbying on American policy. And only through such measures can the U.S. begin to atone for its role in this atrocity and prevent future ones. Thank you.